Good afternoon. Let us start with a few minutes in advance from our, this will give us more room to. So welcome to this roundtable on the very general theme, international financial crisis, can it be back? And welcome to our speakers. We have in alphabetical order Lorenzo Codogno, who has been for a long time the chief economist of our treasury and is now teaching at the London School of Economics. Francesco Giordano, who is chief operating officer at Unicredit. Haihong from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Giuseppe Parigi from the Bank of Italy. Lucrezia Reichlin, she will be on the screen in a couple of minutes, and she will stay with us for a short time. She's from the London Business School, well known in Milan as an editorialist of the Corriere della Sera, and Brad Setzler from the Council of Foreign Relations in New York, and José Siaba Serrate from CARI, Buenos Aires. So as you see, all the continents nearly are represented here, like on the Tiepolo fresco upstairs. My task is mainly to put questions to this glorious panel, well, clearly there is raw material for a crisis around, and there are possible triggers also for the explosion of a second wave of financial disasters, as the one that happened in 2007, 8, and 9. And then in a second wave in the Eurozone in 2010, 11, and 12. We still have the probability to avoid it and to make the world resilient to any accident, but certainly the probability of a new global crisis is a little bit higher than zero. So it's our duty to discuss the issue. The raw material is there because the debt of the world, the total debt, public and private, is very, very large and rising. It is shaped in a different way from what it was at the beginning of the century when the situations brought to the big crisis. It's shaped differently. We are a little bit more on solid grounds, but still the debt is enormous and growing. And the reason is also that the cure of the previous crisis, which was caused by the excessive amount of debt, was in a way how do you say, a homo, how do you say, when you cure an illness with the same homeopathic, a homeopathic cure. That is, we have cured a problem coming from the debt by making more debt. So this is the reason why we are in trouble. And there are triggers, obviously. The most evident one is the fact that there are deep divisions at the global level, geopolitical tensions everywhere, from wars in terms of shooting and wars in terms of trade. There is this wave of nationalism, of populism, that creates enormous uncertainty on the political side, and this clearly. And then you go for more technical triggers, like the normalization of monetary policies. We are coming from several years of extremely expansionary monetary policy practically all over the world. Now we realize that we have to normalize them, but this is a very difficult process. If they manage this process in the wrong way, this could cause several kind of problems to the financial system. There is also some presumption of deregulation, particularly in certain countries like United States, which are so important for the world. And clearly, if we start again with deep deregulation, the risk of a crisis increases. Let me start asking the contribution of our panelists, and if I may, I would like to start with Lucrezia, who she's so kind to stay with us for a short period, but I know she will be able to introduce the topic by maybe, well, she's free to tell us what she prefers, but what we expect from her special knowledge and competences are also a short evaluation of what is the status of the European talks on how to make the euro more resilient and robust. Lucrezia.
Well, thank you, Franco, and sorry not for being in Milan. I'm here in a very rainy London, so it's not a very nice place to be. Yes, I mean, I am happy to discuss about Europe, but let me just put a little bit my discussion into context. I think that I don't think it's in anybody's central scenario to see another 2007-2008 crisis around the corner. However, there are fragilities in many parts of the system, and I think we have to worry both about the international regulation scene and us in Europe in particular about our piece of the story. Now, in terms of international regulation, I will be very brief here because you know, this has not been my assignment, but I think we really have to be very careful to avoid complacency. We have done a lot after 2008 in building a multilateral framework which makes us more robust, and I think it will be extremely dangerous to go back. And I see that there are pressures actually to go back on a number of areas. For example, capital requirements, for example, I mean, on many technical issues, the regulatory framework, the use of internal models, restrictions on the use of banks for mortgage lending, liquidity, and so on. So I think it's very important to be firm and not to engage in sort of competition to the bottom in terms of the regulation. And of course, the geopolitical situation these days is cause for concern. Now, what concerns Europe? Okay, we are part of this, but we also have some problems of our own. And I think that the main question that we should ask is whether what we have been doing since the debt crisis of 2010 in terms of building new pieces of our economic governance is good enough. So in the case in which a new financial crisis should materialize, I mean, which we should never avoid that possibility, I mean, to kind of completely dismiss this possibility, would we be robust, okay? So, I mean, I think that our building effort in building new institutions and new governance, as I said, has been impressive. But I think that the euro needs further reform. And it is encouraging these days to see that both from the French side and the German side, there seems to be an awareness that something more has to be done. And of course, I don't expect this to be an easy ride. I think we are just at the beginning of negotiations. There are very huge cultural differences between what the Germans think, the German approach to these issues, and the French approach to these issues. So I think that it will be a very difficult path to follow. Now, I think that I think that, so let me just talk a little bit more about what the issues are at stake, and especially give a framework for the discussion. So I think the euro has some problems which are common with other jurisdictions and others that are specific. And it is important to understand the specific in order to understand what it is to be done. So what we have learned from the crisis is that the euro, as a specific issue, is prone to self-fulfilling liquidity crisis since the countries don't own their own debt. And for that, we need to be clear of what kind of liquidity backstop we need, okay? And here the discussion is what part is for the central bank and what part is for other tools, for example, the European Stability Mechanism or other possible tools that to be constructed. Another issue which is specific to Europe is that when the crisis strikes, financial markets balkanize, and this makes the functioning of a common monetary policy extremely problematic when financial markets get reorganized along national lines. For that, we need incentive for diversification in the balance sheets of financial institutions, and this is another area of discussion. And this is probably a lot of emphasis in the discussion has been on banks. But these issues of the balkanization of the balance sheet, I think, goes beyond banks. It's the balance sheets, of all the, of corporates as well. The other specific issues is prevention. And, okay, so here I'm talking mostly about fiscal rules. Of course, in a monetary union, the externality of a country's misbehavior on the fiscal sides are larger, and therefore there has been traditionally a big emphasis on fiscal rules. This is unavoidable, but this has also led to some kind of procyclicality, which has made the European crisis much worse than the US crisis, for example. So I think that a serious rethinking of the fiscal framework is also in order, and there are a number of proposals on the table. The other issues which is specific is that when there is a large shocks hitting the euro area, like the one we have seen in the last years, and when the monetary policy is constrained because it's at the zero lower bound, so interest rates are close to zero, a system which is only based on rules and not sufficiently on discretions needs to produce an excessively restrictive fiscal policy overall. So here, the proposals that have been on the table as remedies for this problem has been to construct a fund for dealing with large symmetric shocks and to avoid, so to produce enough fiscal capacity facing this kind of shocks. There are several proposals here, one including from the ECB. So these are my four specific problems of the euro area, and of course there is another one which is more general that affects all jurisdictions, that whenever there is a solvency crisis, whatever rules you have, this is never going to be enough. And so we have to have ways to deal with insolvency problems, which will be not excessively destabilizing. So rules for debt restructuring for both the private sectors and the public sector. Now, there is a Franco-German discussion about debt restructuring, public debt restructuring for the euro area, which I'll be happy to talk about. But I think this also is a discussion which affects financial institutions, and I think it affects the discussion that we have had at the global level. I think that for obvious reasons, we have gone through a system which was too much reliance on the principle of bailout to a system which is now excessively reliant on the principle of bail-in, which is a very good principle, but which does not secure us enough when facing systemic shocks. And so here I'm talking about the rules on basically resolution of insolvent institutions and the use of public funds facing systemic crisis, both for banks and sovereigns. So these are the problems. So for what concerns the European part, so my four specific problems, of course, there is always a best kind of benevolent dictator kind of solution, which would involve, joint guarantees all over the place. And but this is actually politically unfeasible. So I think that for obvious reason, because we are not a politically integrated area. So we need a compromise. And I think that it is important that all parties understand that any solution will be the result of compromise. And I think the key principle of this compromise is that we need both crisis prevention and crisis mitigation tools. And we need a reform which minimize or remove this trade-off. And I think this is the basis of some of the German Franco proposals that have been around. Which have weaknesses and strengths, but I think the idea, the basic principle, I think is still it is valid, and it is within this framework that we should think about the specific proposals. Now, I have a lot to say about the specific proposal, but maybe I think it's best if I stop here, and then maybe in a second round, if there is time, I will talk about what I think. Unless you want me to go on, Franco, it's up to you. I can talk for another hour, but I think everybody will fall asleep. So just tell me if you want me to go and get a more specific discussion on the proposal on deposit insurance or other things like that. Or if you prefer me to, I mean, I think this is kind of the framework and the basic.
It's fine. If you have time to stay with us a little bit more, you will maybe have the opportunity to go deeper lately. This fine as an introduction. So let me now ask to our panelists the same question for everybody, and I hope you will be providing short answers that illuminate us on the fundamental problem of this afternoon. That is it true that the probability to have a big global new financial crisis is significantly higher than zero, or are we talking about nothing? I mean, so from your specific point of view, from your professional point of view, from your geographical also point of view, how far should we be worried about this general issue? So maybe we can really follow the alphabetical order in this sense and ask to Lorenzo, who later will help us to go deeper into the European issues introduced by Lucrezia, but now he has probably more generally things to say.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think Lucrezia did already a wonderful job to kind of frame the debate, and so I try to kind of pick up some of the issues. First of all, I think the global economic environment has never been so favorable in terms of economic growth. Yes, we have seen a couple of months of somewhat softer indicators, okay, so maybe the situation is a little bit stabilizing. But certainly, since the bottom of the crisis, the global economy has never been in such a good shape. And so it's not a crisis environment, so we have to say that. But I fully agree that there are plenty of reasons to be concerned, and certainly there are many risks around. Given that we discussed in the context of, some kind of international framework, one reason to be concerned, I think, it comes from politics, or at least from the multilateral approach of policies around the globe. I mean, since World War II, the U.S. administration has always been an anchor of stability, financial, economic, and political stability in the world. Now it's a source of instability. And certainly this is a concern. And it is also a concern because it is systemically undermining the multilateral approach of institutions, which is also a concern because in case another crisis breaks out, you wonder whether these multilateral institutions are ready to respond, given that, again, the multilateral approach seems to be much weaker today than a few years ago. Also, as Professor Bruni mentioned at the very beginning, we are in a situation in which central banks are gradually to normalize the monetary policy situation, coming from many years of unorthodox policies. Inevitably, this will produce some risks. I mean, I'm confident that central banks will do a good job in withdrawing this exceptional stimulus, but we have to acknowledge that risks are there and can actually manifest themselves in different ways. Also, the withdrawal of the extraordinary accommodation, given that it's not going to be phased in, will not be synchronous across the globe, but will inevitably produce also some tensions in terms of exchange rates. And given the attitude of different administrations towards exchange rates these days, that in itself might actually be a source of tensions and problems. Then the banking issue. Well, I think that there's been a wave of regulation over the past 20 years, and certainly over the past 10 years there's been an acceleration to the point that my guess is that today we are in a much better shape in terms of the stability of financial institutions across the globe, if only again because the regulatory pressure has been massive. Now, clearly, there is now kind of reflection on whether it is too much, and it is probably correct. I think the U.S. administration has already changed tack a little bit, which part of it is a little bit concerning because certainly you don't want to kind of throw away all the good things that have been developed over the past few years. But at the same time, probably we have gone a little bit too far in terms of regulating, and probably the regulatory burden is a little bit excessive right now, so probably some simplification and some streamlining would be necessary, provided that, again, the framework remains in place so that there are some certain guarantees. But I think the new sources of risk could be outside of the banking sector these days. And we have seen a development of shadow banking. We have seen a development of big financial institutions that, to some extent, replace the intermediation function of banks. We have seen an increase in indexing in financial markets. We have seen an increase in debt, which was mentioned. We have seen an increase in valuations in stock markets. So basically, many sectors, many areas of financial markets are overstretched right now, which doesn't mean necessarily that you are going to see a correction tomorrow, but certainly you enter into an area which might be risky. So if you see a substantial correction in the stock market, you wonder whether the financial system is able to withstand a deep correction. My reaction would be yes, it is. It is much stronger today than in the past, but you never know because these things sometimes go out of control, and there are areas that maybe have not been addressed enough in terms of regulation, in terms of monitoring, and which might become the focus of the next regulatory pressure. But for now, they haven't been addressed enough, and so you never know. Again, the level of debt is high. The level of valuations is high as well in many areas of financial markets. So again, there are probably some risks of a correction. Moving back to Europe, and Lucrezia already mentioned that this is a very important time for major governance changes in Europe. I'm quite honest. I'm not holding my breath because of that. I don't have very high expectations on this process, and I have to say that the recent developments, political developments in Italy, do not help. Okay, in this process. I think a couple of months ago I was sufficiently confident that at least the completion of the banking union could be delivered. Keep in mind that we are very close to the deadline, because by the June summit, our leaders will have to make a decision, at least a political decision. Then on a technical level, can be addressed later on. But I think even the banking union now seems to be a little bit at risk. Completing the banking union means the deposit insurance and the common backstop. Again, I'm still confident that at least that will be delivered, but I'm not so sure that I was, as sure as I was 2 months ago. And then on top of that, I think I'm totally agree that we need to go beyond that in order to provide a more stable framework for Europe, because Europe is intrinsically fragile by construction, I would say. So the sooner we move towards fiscal and political integration, the better. But at the same time, I don't see the conditions, the political conditions for moving very fast in that regards, and therefore I'm not particularly optimistic, I have to say. I think there is a chance to address some of the issues which might be related to a modest increase in fiscal capacity, related to some specific items such as military security, border control, stuff like that. I think there is probably a chance to see some modest changes in governance in terms of streamlining the role of the Commission versus the Eurozone, the Eurogroup. But these are minor changes. Probably there is a more significant change related to what could become the European Monetary Fund, therefore changing the role of the ESM, which might be in itself a positive and might actually be an additional tool, a strengthening tool to address maybe the next crisis. But again, I wouldn't be hugely optimistic about future developments. Unfortunately, it's the political situation which does not allow to move very fast in this regards. So basically, we remain somewhat exposed to a future crisis. We remain somewhat vulnerable, and crises happen. It's a fact of life. Sometimes it will happen. The next one, we just have to hope that it will be not too dissimilar from the last we have already seen and we have already prepared for. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Franco, since I have to say to go.
Yes, please.
I won't have. I just want to respond 2 minutes to Lorenzo, saying that I totally agree that I'm not at all optimistic about this negotiation. I think we have a framework for the negotiation, but I don't think that we will see anything anyway soon. So we have to hope that the financial crisis of systemic proportions will not come too soon. Okay, so that. But I think Europe remains vulnerable because of the specific issues that I try to describe. Unfortunately, I agree with Lorenzo.
See, on this tone of not full optimism, thank you very much for being with us for some time, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
So let's go on. On one of the, by the way, I think tomorrow, if I'm not wrong, tomorrow the IMF will issue its global financial stability report. So we are expressing opinion without the arbiters. Tomorrow we're going to have the official evaluation of this type of risk. On one of the triggers of this risk that you mentioned, and that is the normalization of monetary policies, ISPI is contributing a policy brief to the T20 working group on financial architecture, which is coordinated by José. And we are proposing to set up something that you will read it, something that could help to coordinate a little bit the actions of monetary authorities in particular in terms of announcement to the markets, because clearly central bankers are talking to each other. They don't tell us, and they deny in a way that they talk to each other, but they talk to each other a lot. So probably they do coordinate a little bit, but the markets are not informed on their strategies, and they suspect that some competition in depreciation or in normalization or in hardness or in softness, I don't know, something can happen that creates disorder and triggers a crisis. So the markets need to be nourished with some strategic statements on the fact that financial markets at the global level, being so interconnected, are also governed by a group of people that really talk to each other in a responsible way and don't say, when you ask Draghi, what about the American monetary policy, will refrain from commenting, from the dollar refrains from commenting. If you ask to the Fed the same question, they will always say it's not our own business, we don't interfere with other countries' monetary policy. I mean, we should be reasonably sure that they do have some common views on what to do, and they announce it in a formal way to the markets. In our policy brief that we are still completing and refining, we have a couple of institutional suggestions to help conveying this type of strategic information to the markets. Francesco, it's maybe your turn to give us a short opinion on the general theme of this afternoon.
Yeah, so many thanks for the invitation. I'll bring the discussion to the somewhat narrower issue of banking perspective, particularly for a European banker. So I was interested when I got the invitation because the title read International Financial Crisis, Can It Be Back? And of course my first reaction is, oh, when did he leave? And I think that's a true question in the sense that, especially if you look at the Italian banking sector, of course, until relatively recently, the general accepted opinion was that we were still not quite entirely out of the wood. And with a slight presumption, I would like to say that the action that Unicredit in particular has taken, its capital increase, aggressive disposal of non-performing loans, cost reduction, internal restructuring, has contributed, not alone, but given an important contribution to somewhat change the perspective of the solidity both of the European and of the Italian banking sector, so much so that we can perhaps say today that the general opinion is that a crisis that originates from the banking sector in Europe is relatively unlikely. Why is it unlikely? In the short time that I have, let me give three flashes in particular. First of all, the sector in Italy, but not only in Italy, generally throughout Europe, is undergone a very important degree of deleveraging. If you look, for example, at the main countries where Unicredit operates, thus Italy, Germany, and Austria, in all countries the ratio of lending to GDP is still lower what it was in 2007. This because loan growth has been moderate, but also because there has been in all countries, frankly not just in Europe, an important portfolio cleanup where sadly non-performing loans have been taken out of the portfolio. So is not necessarily exposed a very positive news, but the current situation today is considerably more solid as, let's say, the rotten fruits have been shaken out of the tree. NPLs with different degrees of speed in the different markets, and probably with some delay in Italy retrospectively, NPLs have been addressed quite forcefully. It's still work in progress. The ratio of NPLs on total loans in Italy is slightly above 15%, comes down from 16.5%. A lot of the drop was also the so-called Operation Fino, the 18 billion disposal of non-performing loans carried out by Unicredit. frankly, 15% is still a relatively high amount, and I think further steps need to be taken across the system, and we have, for our part, communicated very specifically over the years what step we intend to take. I think a further reduction of this ratio needs to be done. I think it is generally, however, high on the attention of any banker, and of course regulators are contributing in ways that will push in the direction. Lastly, you have probably heard proposal to introduce both at Pillar 2 and at legal level calendar provisioning, so very high coverage for non-performing loans after a number of years will certainly push further into a reduction. Final, maybe most important example, the world for us since 2007 has changed very significantly when we look at the way we are regulated, and I would say by and large it's changed for the better. We have mainly and foremostly one single supervisor, that being the ECB. So we have no regulatory arbitrage, no conflicting views and methodologies, but one single rule book, one regulators, one single point of entry. And I think this has been rather an epochal change. And as I said, for sure, this is gone for the better. On a number of other items, which I don't have time to list, but they're fairly well known. The single resolution to accompany the single supervisory mechanism is also a very important change in the way banks are managed and in the ways capital is located and sourced. We have Basel IV coming, MREL and TLAC. I think in the interest of having a discussion, I will not dwell too much on those items, only to say that at times we had the impression that when regulators identify a need and an issue to address, they do it quite effectively, but they all run for the same items. A little bit when kids play football, that they all run after the ball. I think they should really be distributed, each playing its role in a more systematic way. At times this results in rather confusing messages, in some forms of over-regulation, and in very costly implementation items that we have to carry out. But having said that, I think we as Unicredit have a view that the regulatory environment since 2007 has improved, that the dialogue with regulators is rather positive, and that while we strongly call for a normalization of the environment, so a setting of the rule, not continuous incremental rules, we think that the regulatory environment contributes positively to having delivered a more stable and solid banking environment for Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. Maybe later you will tell us a little bit more about how the management of a big bank is internally providing the right rules inside the bank to confront such a sort of complex and risky atmosphere. Now we may perhaps ask Gao to give us her opinion on the theme of today from the point of view also of his country, which is far away but extremely important.
Thank you very much. So China, so actually we can say it is avoided a hard landing. Last year, the growth rate was at 6.9%, which is lower than previous years, but still higher than many other countries. So this is good news, not only for China itself, but also for the global economy, because China is so integrated in the world economy in many ways, in trade, global value chains, and investment and finance. And also, China is in a we call it great transformation. China's economy is going to be a service driven consumption-driven economy. And this is something already happened and will continue to be the way. And of course, there are some concerns. One is the debt issue. We have many different sources of the data to capture the true color of this the development, and there are some good reasons to worry because the corporate debt is very high and grows very fast, and there are some the vulnerabilities within those debt dynamic, not only because of the enterprises, the ownership issues, but also because it's linked to the we call it shadow banking system. Shadow banking issue is another concern for the whole economy, especially financial stability. So actually, the government tried very hard to do something. For instance, to cut overcapacity. We heard a lot of discussions and the proposals to have identify which sector are extremely belong to this overcapacity category, and it's very targeted objective. And of course, there are many innovative measures, such as the debt to equity swap to reduce the corporate debt burden, and also the debt to bond swap is another tools to help reduce the public sector government debt issues. And the local government debt issues is always on the top concern, and the central government try very hard to close down the risky themes. So if you look at the recent data, actually the debt to GDP ratio declined. It's a very good sign. And of course, maintaining a decent growth rate is always important because we need the number, denominators, and it's kind of two dynamic coming together. And shadow banking actually is a big concern because it's so complicated. It's few people to understand it, and it's linked. It's across markets and multi-players and different institutions, financial institutions involved, especially banks. And even banks, traditional loans, we have the data, on balance sheet data, and the government can have a very decent, sense of to carry out regulation. But somehow the shadow banking is not. There are similar risks, like the developed countries, shadow banking issue. But also there are some Chinese characteristics. We call it bank's shadow because it's linked to banks closely. It's not pure securitization. So anyway, there are many measures to solve the problem, especially when the government think there is a potential systematic risk. And if you follow, there is it's a reshuffle of this regulatory framework, and there are new setups. So the purpose is to centralize this regulatory power and to just fix loopholes there, because there are many loopholes within the system. So those measures, I'm quite confident that at least in the short term, we can reduce the risks, and which help China itself the policymakers can focus more on the fundamental, the real sector development, and also the globally can reduce the domestic vulnerability to face the new development of this monetary normalization, because we're concerned about, especially for emerging economies, so always receiver of this signal and the policy change. So the capital flows, foreign exchange market volatility is always concern for the monetary policy, because they have to take after the the stability and the openness, especially for China. The capital flow is always difficult to balance. It's the stability and the openness. So overall, I think China is on the path to reduce its domestic risk, but also try to play a bigger role in a global market. You see, there are many activities, especially G20 is on our agenda. China is a big supporter, and of course, at global levels, MF and many others. So I won't touch that, but definitely, I mean, it's like good news. We're confident to be able to avoid short-term risk, but there are long-term challenges, of course, in China and for the global economy as well. This might.
Thank you. The Chinese case is particularly important and interesting. When I hear somebody saying that there's a risk of financial crisis starting in China, I think what we were used to think about China, I mean, that it was a non-market command economy, highly centralized, where a financial crisis was simply impossible. I mean, if you can control the economy from the center and there is a hole here, you feel it by a command. So it's a contradiction in terms that a non-market economy has a coordination crisis in a way, like a financial crisis is. But the point is that China has evolved and is evolving, and in a way is much more a market economy than it used to be. So this is the reason why the problems come up. And also the transition from a non-market to a market economy is really the danger. For instance, when you come to international financial flows and exchange rate management, I mean, this country is sometimes liberalizing a lot with the rest of the world, perhaps violating the basic rules of the optimal order of liberalization. That is, they first liberalize with the rest of the world before liberalizing internally. So there are a lot of transition problems that, in a way, China is really a very important case also to study and understand our own problems. Last time I was in Beijing, I started my visit by visiting the person from the IMF there, and I found this German guy completely full of pieces of paper, and he was, "What are you doing?" I said, there was this table filled of pieces of paper. "What are you doing?" "I'm just counting shadow banks." And I said, "What is a shadow bank?" And we went on for the whole afternoon discussing what is shadow bank. So there is also a question of defining terms and looking through mysteries. But what we learn about shadow banks in China is also interesting to understand the shadow banks in Europe and in America. Can I ask now to Giuseppe Parigi to tell us his evaluation in his double, with his double hat in a way. On one side he's a central banker, on the other side he's a diplomat, in the sense that he's the person in charge of following the G20 cooperation for the Bank of Italy. Please.
Yes, thank you very much. I will try to put to summarize a little bit what has been said up to now, because you have basically bombarded with a lot of information about crisis. You know, the crisis is around the corner, maybe no, maybe yes. The problem is that we are not in a crisis yet, and probably we are in a typical situation when things are going well, and people start thinking, are we ready to to react to a possible crisis. Now, the situation, let's say, we have not to forget that the situation now is good. Is good because for the first time, this year, let's say, last year, this year, probably next year, there is a sort of synchronized growth around the world. I mean, the advanced economies are growing altogether. Even the euro area is growing. It was the laggard of the advanced economies, but now even the euro area is growing and probably is going to grow for some time now. The emerging market economies are doing well. And also China, with all the problems we have listened up to now, they are managing a little bit better the situation. So this is the situation. And there are the first two magic words: avoid complacency. That means we have not to rest on this situation, but we have to think about what can come after. And why is this? If we want, we may remind the words of the managing director of the International Monetary Fund that say, just quoting Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, that it's much easier to repair the roof when the sun is shining than when it's raining. So now it's a period when the sun is shining, and repair the roof. Which roof and what sort of repairing? And here, some consideration about the risk that we have just listened to. There are two basic family of risk. One is financial vulnerabilities. Financial vulnerabilities basically are the situation, the monetary situation around the world. Not only, I'm not talking about a specific area now, but the monetary situation, the monetary policy situation around the world. You have heard about this strange word, normalization of monetary policy. What does that mean? That means that monetary policy is not normal now. There is a debate about this, but just think about what happened in the just few years story when this whole story about the unconventional monetary policy began. It began in 2011 when the United States decided to go for this quantitative easing monetary policy. Very strange way of saying that they were just expanding the monetary base just to help the economy. And when they started the whole thing, immediately there was a debate about, but what are you doing? How can you come back? And they say, don't worry, they said, we know how to go on reverse. That was their conviction. And the signal that not everything was exactly as they thought came 2 years later, in 2013, when Bernanke, the Fed president at that time, decided to say that sooner or later this monetary policy had to be changed and to go back. The day after, but not the day after, some minutes later, that declaration, there was a big turmoil on the market. And all these guys were really surprised and caught by surprise because they could never think of such a strong reaction to just few words. Not action, words. And so they realized that going back was not that easy, was not an easy matter. And so it began what is now common, and the fact that the central bankers around the world had to first communicate very, very clearly their action at the markets in order to prepare the markets for what has to come. So, prepare the markets, for instance, to the fact that they started revising their monetary policy. And this is what is called now communication of central bankers, and why communication is supposed to be another sort of instrument of monetary policy. Then, at that point, the central bankers decided also that it was very useful also to exchange views on this decision, and that it was better not to go alone on this, in order not to put some problems on the markets. So the Americans began to say, okay, we are moving along the lines of a change in monetary policy, but following the evolution of the economy. Remember that we are not doing anything against our economy, but following the economy. So they said, we are looking to data. And this is another guideline that is followed by all central banks now. Then another thing you have to remember that the first to begin this renormalization of monetary policy were the United States, of course. But they are the only one. Remember that the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and other central banks are still in what is called the unconventional monetary policy. So there is a sort of balancing. One central bank is moving back, the other banks are keeping the situation as it is. The problem is, what will happen when the other banks, the other central banks, will begin changing their monetary policy? Again, it will be crucial to look at what the numbers say. That means it will be crucial to see how the economies are faring, because this action depends on the evolution of the economy. No central bank will act against, let's say, or putting their economy at risk. That is one message that is clearly stated, clearly communicated to the markets. But the problem is, what happens if these data change rapidly, and so decisions have to be taken rapidly? No one knows. And this is one of the risks, one of the financial vulnerabilities. So, the other kind of risks that we are confronting are coming, let's say, more from the politics of the world, from geopolitics. And one of these is protectionism. Let's call it with its name, and not with all these kind of definition like inward-looking policies. It's protectionism. The problem is, if you remember, when the G20 became on the scene of the economic environment, maybe the only success of the G20 action was a reaction to the crisis in 2008, exactly also because of avoiding any sort of protectionist reaction. If you remember the other big crisis of the 30s of last centuries, one of the consequences, terrible consequences of that crisis, was that the first reaction of every single state was a protectionist decision. And that worsened dramatically the situation. So it was very clear to the politicians, to the central bankers, to the economists, that this time should be different. And this time, protectionism should be avoided at all costs. But that was 10 years ago. Now the economies are expanding, are growing. And so protectionism is coming back. Why? It's coming back because also of other evolution, and also because of other trends that are characterizing our economies, our countries. These trends are called secular trends, if you want, or maybe, let's say, longer-term trends. And one of these is demographics. In the advanced economies, our population are growing older and older, and this is putting some tension, not now, but in the near future probably, on the capacity of the resilience of our economy, of the possibility of increasing productivity. Productivity is the other magic word. Productivity is the one thing that may guarantee a sort of progress, evolution. Without productivity, we are doomed to die, in a sense, economically speaking, of course. So, demographics, but the other one is technological change. Technological change, probably you see it all the day, is very rapid, is changing our lives completely, but not only our lives, our way of producing is displacing a lot of people. A lot of jobs are lost. And probably more than this are going to be lost in the future. And these are putting a lot of people in very bad situation, and they are reacting with the only arm they have, that is with their political support. So, populism, nationalism, and so on and so forth. So protectionism is back, and with protectionism, all sorts of things. Now, what should we do then? These are trends that cannot be stopped. What should we do? And let's go back to the story of the Let's Act when the sun is shining. In this period, what can the different governments do? But one thing they can do is implement structural reforms. Those reforms that may help coping with the situation in the near future. But there is one problem here. These reforms, everyone knows that these reforms, the effects of these reforms, are going to be beneficial, yes, but when? Not now. Not now. Maybe in some years from now. And in the meantime? In the meantime, probably, we are not going to see any effect if we're lucky. But the problem is that the first effects may be also negative. Now, I don't want to support any sort of political position, but think about one of these reforms, the Jobs Act, okay? You may discuss whatever you want, it may be a flawed reform, everything you want, but that is a reform. And its main effects, short-term effects, were deemed very negative. And this was not a surprise. So the problem is, in this case, if we know that we have to implement reforms because we have no other possibility, and if these reforms are going probably to have some negative effects in the short period, what should we do? We have to use all our weapons in the short period to counteract these effects. And these weapons are all sorts of fiscal, monetary rooms we can use to support demand. Support demand meaning also helping people that are struck by this situation, that are displaced, try to find ways in order not to have them only to support the cost of these reforms, and try to help them in a sense. So, for instance, one possibility is to enhance our situation from the point of view of infrastructure investment, that is, public investment. It's true that Italy, for instance, has not much fiscal room, but it can be found by just reconverting part of our budget, by trying to find ways in the budget. But then there is also a multilateral, or if you want, an international cooperation issues here. Those countries that have more fiscal room have to use these rooms in order also to help other countries. Think about the situation in Europe. We know that there are countries that are in surplus. Think about Germany. Germany has a surplus, current account surplus. That means that have an advance in terms of saving with respect to their investment. They are saving too much. But something about 8–9% of their GDP. So it's huge. They have to use this room in order to improve their situation, of course, because public investment in Germany, but also stimulating demand in Europe. And this is true at world level, for instance. So, I stop here because I think...
Thank you very much. So now, one of the most prestigious think tanks in the world is the Council of Foreign Relations in New York. Is the expression of the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan part of the American elite. Brad Setzels is here with us, and thank you for being here. And you may Now give us your impression.
Thanks so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. There's been much said about Europe, and then when I'm in the US, I'm generally considered an expert on Europe rather than an expert on the US. But since I am in Europe, I figure my comparative advantage is reversed, and I should probably talk about the United States. I was quite relieved when Lorenzo described the US as being traditionally a source of stability in the global system. I remember quite well 8 or 9 years ago when the US and its financial system were a source of global instability. We haven't always been, even before the election of Donald Trump, paragons of international cooperation either. Fortunately, I think the risk that the US poses of triggering a new financial crisis are in the first instance relatively modest. But then I want to go into the ways in which I fear the US may be making a new kind of policy mistake. Why do I think the risk of triggering a new financial crisis are modest? Well, our last financial crisis fundamentally stemmed from a loss of confidence in loans secured against US housing. Those who lent money weren't confident they'd made good loans. And then there was a corresponding loss of confidence in all financial institutions that had made these loans. And it turned out that through complicated, sophisticated securitization and fancy funding arrangements, that a whole lot of European banks were in effect acting as shadow banks in the US market, raising money in the wholesale market, so from other sophisticated investors, and buying complex securities. So when there was a loss of confidence in US housing debt and a loss of confidence in institutions that held US housing debt, that became not just a US financial crisis, but at least a US and European financial crisis. Fortunately, I think the banks in Italy didn't play this game. And so in the first instance, Italy was well insulated. The same certainly cannot be said of banks in France, Switzerland, Germany, and the UK. Today, that risk is very moderate. The US housing finance has been tamed. Most mortgages now are made according to standards set by the US government and backed by federal agencies. There is relatively little subprime debt, and financial institutions in the US and in Europe hold much larger buffers to protect against the risk of loss. Sounds pretty good. The problem, I think, is not necessarily in the realm of financial intermediation, but rather in the fact that perhaps because of the legacy of the slow recovery, the US is embarking on a rather interesting fiscal experiment. Late in the recovery, at a time when unemployment is low, when growth is relatively good, the US is embracing a fiscal expansion of almost 2% of GDP. Now, I happen to agree that Germany probably should be doing more of a fiscal expansion, and that there is perhaps fiscal space throughout the euro area to do more. And I don't think that the US lacks fiscal space. We probably can borrow the money. But nonetheless, I think this policy poses some risk. There's one way in which it doesn't really, I think, or at least I hope, pose risk. The US is an integrated fiscal union, a monetary union, a political union. And so therefore the kind of self-fulfilling debt runs that cause trouble in Europe are somewhat hard to envision. To use a metaphor of earlier in the conference, this probably isn't a wolf at the door, It's more termites rotting at the or working away at the foundation. But even if the risk of a run on US debt is hard to imagine, the decision to embrace a pro-cyclical fiscal policy has risk. The easiest way, I think, to think of those risks is to note the following. US debt to GDP, whether defined as fiscal debt to GDP or external debt to GDP, was roughly stable before the last fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficits of around 3% of GDP are consistent, given US growth and US funding costs, with a stable debt to GDP ratio, which was around 75% of GDP. And a trade deficit of around 2.5% or 3% of GDP was consistent with a high but stable external debt ratio. Net external debt in the US is about 50% of GDP. With the fiscal expansion and the tax cuts, the US fiscal deficit will rise to above 5% of GDP, which, while not catastrophic, clearly puts US fiscal debt on an ever-rising trajectory. And so it therefore doesn't meet a classic definition of stability. And if, as is likely, the demand stimulus that the US provides to an economy that doesn't necessarily need demand stimulus, if that ends up spilling over to the rest of the world through a larger trade deficit, or if the US simply ends up paying much more in interest to the rest of the world, given that a large fraction of US debt is now held globally, the US current account deficit will also rise, and will rise to levels which, again, while not catastrophic, would put US external debt on an ever-rising trajectory. Now, these are slow-moving problems. They don't necessarily give rise to the kind of drama that the US experienced in 2008, but I do think they create some subtle set of risk. Rather than go through all of them, I just wanted to highlight and finish by talking about the risk that I think worries me the most. And in some sense, it's the risk that we haven't observed. The US has been very lucky, in my view. After we did the fiscal expansion, the dollar has depreciated. Europe, fortunately, is doing relatively well. And for complex reasons, the financial markets haven't bid up the dollar, even as US interest rates have increased. But I do worry that if that were to change, and if the dollar were to rise significantly, it could give rise to a set of important risks, while recognizing it would make Europe's life easier. Risk one is that it would draw out the contradictions in President Trump's economic agenda. President Trump wants to accelerate US growth, he wants tax cuts, but he also wants the trade deficit to fall. A stronger dollar would make that contradiction very obvious. And I would note, perhaps it's not the cause of President Trump's recent actions, but I doubt that he has not noticed that US trade deficit actually kind of increased pretty significantly in the last 6 months. It's up like 15% year over year. And it's certainly illustrative of this risk. I think the second risk is how a stronger dollar impacts the rest of the world. We saw a little bit of how that played out in 2014 and 2015. A lot of emerging markets still borrow in dollars, and some key countries still manage their currency against the dollar. The most important, of course, is China. And what really worries me is the possibility that a stronger dollar would push up China's currency precisely when China, for its own reasons, is tightening and slowing, and China concludes, or some of the pressures on China's exchange rate reemerge. My suspicion is then that some of the protectionist sentiment that has been so obvious in the past week will become front and center.
Couldn't be more clear. Jose.
Yes.
Oh. Tell us a bit of your ideas. Oh, I'm sorry.
And some water too. Sure. Well, this is my page. I was writing different subjects because as I was the last one, I want to talk about one issue that will be mentioned, but all the issues I put were mentioned. So my participation was a bet on a crisis emerging by the time I was called to speak, and that didn't happen. So I will take a view of some of these issues, and then I will mention one that was not mentioned, which is this one developed here. Okay? So, okay. First I wrote about the political winds, how the winds are changing. I put Trump, I put Brexit, and I put nationalisms in Europe. They were mentioned, but one has to feel very uncomfortable when you see the US and Great Britain, or Great Britain and the US, who invented this business of globalizations, who are the stronger defenders, the custodians of this business, the ones who push us, everyone in the emerging markets, towards this kind of business, and you have to feel comfortable when you see them retreating, when you see those democracies and the voters there telling their leaders, well, we might reverse or we should turn. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is Mr. Trump, specifically, in the sense of the contradictions Brad mentioned. On one extreme, the economy is growing very fast in the US. You have a very strong expansion. The Federal Reserve wants to take out stimulus, and then in Christmas, the US Congress approves tax reform. So you're having an economy operating at full steam, and then you add fiscal policy on top of that. And when the central banks are planning to normalize monetary policy, they want to do it and handle it with care. Mr. Trump doesn't allow that luxury because he puts more pressure on that. And so central banks maybe lack the room to maneuver with a kind of, I would say, soundness they would prefer. If Mr. Trump would stand quiet, it would be easier, but he doesn't. So in one extreme, he's pushing more activity by lowering taxes. On the other extreme, he talks trade, and he puts tariffs on steel, on aluminum, and pressures China. So in one extreme, he's putting pressure on a stronger economy. On the other extreme, he's putting on the table this protectionism issue, which can trigger, if it happens, can trigger not more growth, but a sudden stop of growth. Everybody knows this is the way Mr. Trump likes to negotiate, so this is in a sense a bluff, but maybe there might be any mistake or reaction, and what is not pretended ends up occurring. But this was mentioned, so I won't mention that. We are aware of the difficulties and the risks of normalizing monetary policy, and I would say in this context, this is a context where politics is changing itself from normal to subnormal. So you have to normalize monetary policy, but you have a political context that's moving against that willingness and driving you to uncharted waters. But that was also mentioned, I think. What I would like to say that you have not to underestimate when societies leave social discomfort and such huge disappointments. I come from Argentina, where that has happened several times, and you see how fast political mood can change, voters can change, and decide that the direction they voted for some years ago is no longer okay, and they want change to the other extreme. In emerging countries, you can do that very quickly. It was supposed not to be possible to do in Great Britain or in the US, and now we are finding that that could also happen there. Okay. That was mentioned, so I won't mention that. There's another fact which I think is very interesting. We are experiencing a huge increase in debt. Increase in debt, increase in public debt was a way to solve the crisis, in a sense, to pay for the private sector problems. We are experiencing in these last years an increase in debt without productivity growth, with shrinking demographics, and that's a recipe for trouble. That's a recipe for asset price inflation, for example. And now I will want to go to the subject that was not mentioned, and I think it's relevant. And this subject is a minor one, but I think it can teach us a lot, and it's this issue of the cryptocurrencies, or crypto assets, as Europeans prefer to call them. Cryptocurrencies are not currencies. They are more than 1,500 cryptocurrencies, which is just so big a number to believe that you might have so many currencies. Currencies need, or monies need, demand, usage, and there are benefits of scale, so you might have success in only a few number of those currencies, or maybe in no currency. So the first thing that I want to say is you're having a new phenomenon of the cryptocurrencies, which is too new to deem it something of the past. This is clearly an offspring of the new post-Lehman regulatory framework. They were conceived, they were developed under this new regulatory framework, and that's very interesting. I would say they are obviously too small in size to be deemed or to be considered a systemic risk. They are not systemic because the size up to this moment is small, even though they have been growing at a frantic pace. If that pace continues, they might turn into something big. They might end up disappearing before that point. But size is not the only thing that matters in terms of systemic risk. And that's something you have to remember, because this is something that was not important in the last crisis, but it was important in other crises. The US, for example, had in the 80s a saving and loan financial crisis where banks were not too big to fail, but they were too many. And too many small banks caused huge problems. So cryptocurrencies might be small, but you might understand and take into notice that you might be small but lethal. For example, a bird is small, but a bird within a jet turbine or a jet engine is little. So this is very important. They are a new phenomenon. They were not born because of problems with the old regulatory regime. They have developed under this new regime. People are buying these and paying prices well above their intrinsic value. And you know that because their intrinsic value is zero. And in that sense, they are very much alike any other currency. Prices are way above that level. And you have lots of tokens, of currencies, of assets, whatever you might call them. People have been buying them. These have survived ups and downs, and falling from graces. And in this case, I want to say that's not very common in a lot of other bubbles that have a huge episode, they fall down and they never come back. These keep coming back despite all the problems. They have been called a fraud, for example, by Mr. Jamie Dimon, who is the CEO of JP Morgan. But 1 month later, he regretted, and he said, I will never issue a statement on these currencies, which is something terrible, because it shows you that as he runs a bank, even if he thinks this is fraud, if other banks want to get into this business, he also has to get into it, even though he thinks it's a fraud. They have been called a Ponzi scheme, a perfect Ponzi scheme, a brilliant scam by Paul Singer, Nouriel Roubini, and others, and the president of the World Bank, and by the general manager of the BIS, they were called a fraud, a Ponzi scheme, and an environmental disaster. So in this case, you have a bubble or something that resembles a bubble. And remember that of having an increase in debt and no productivity growth. So in this case, you cannot say there's a conspiracy of silence. This is very much subprime. This is very much the dot-com experience. But everybody says this is a fraud, Ponzi scheme, and whatever, and people keeps on buying. And this is the markets. And you have experienced a lot of bubbles in spite heavily regulation or regulatory norms. In this case, this is outside regulation. This is the new shadow banking or the new shadow market or the market-based finance, whatever you may call it. And this is borderless by nature. This is a new thing, a new technological thing. You can run it from wherever you want, and you can sell it, and you can make business from the cyberspace, which is something that you don't know where it is located. Okay? So I think you have here, in this small experience but growing experience, all the ingredients that in the past, with the old regulation, brought you to several financial crises or headaches. This is, I would say, a pilot experience, very small, but it could turn out to be very big. And it is showing you that even you have improved your regulation, you might still have an old type of financial crisis running on the top of new technology. And maybe technology, this distributed ledger, is something good or bad. But this technology is open source. So you can replicate it. And people know that. Okay? So I would say animal spirits are here. So in that sense, we are not in financial crisis anymore. We are in the period between two financial crises. So that was the only subject that was left for the end. And so that I was forced to talk about this trivial thing. Thank you.
And apparently from the papers we know of the G20 will discuss also this topic.
Sure.
Apparently, yes, there's some intentions,
agenda, yeah.
intentions to put it in the agenda. Well, we still have maybe 15 minutes or so. So if Lorenzo, before going away, has very short second round considerations taking into account what has already been said.
Thank you very much. I do apologize, I have to leave very shortly, but I have 3 points actually picking up some of the comments already made. First of all, I take the point of Prasad. I mean, I understand that the source of the crisis was indeed the US back in 2007-8. But at least at that time, the US administration had a constructive attitude towards international multilateral organization, which is no longer the case today. and that is a big change. Second point on protectionism, we have discussed a lot protectionism, which is closely linked to globalization. We shouldn't forget that globalization was also a force for wealth, for a number of millions of people in emerging markets came out of poverty thanks to globalization. And there's been a huge development. We are talking about China here, but also many Asian countries came out of underdevelopment, basically, thanks to globalization. So globalization is a major force for development and improving in living standards. However, we have to acknowledge, and everybody knows by now, that has some side effects. And that has problems in developed countries, particularly the workers that have been affected by relocation of companies and so forth. But if we read the textbook 10 years ago, 20 years ago about globalization, back then they were saying that when you have globalization, you have to compensate the losers and do reforms in order to change the ways of production. Probably, many countries, many governments forgot this second part, okay? So everybody went for globalization, forgot that they need to do some homework at home in order to compensate and offset that. As a result, we have these protectionist tensions today. I'm very worried. I totally share the concerns that were expressed here, because I think it's not much the size of the trade that is affected, because at the end of the day, if you add up steel and aluminium, it's not such a big deal in terms of global trade. Okay, if you even add up intellectual property, yes, it's more concerning, but we are still talking about a relatively small size. The problem is that today's production is organized in global supply chains. If you disrupt the supply chain, it can have a multiplier effect in the trade, everywhere. So I think we tend to underestimate the power of disruption that can be caused by protectionist wars. And I think that could become apparent pretty soon. Finally, on shadow banking, I think, I totally share your considerations if we talk about Bitcoin, okay? If we talk about Bitcoin, I think I agree 100%. If we move to blockchain, we move to something else, not necessarily shadow banking is a bad thing. I mean, during the crisis, many countries struggle, try to get some shadow banking finance in their economy, to be quite honest, because the economies were in big trouble because of lack of credit. And one way to diversify away, and one way to kind of rely less on the banking sector, which was in big trouble, was to get some money from mutual funds. If we call that as shadow banking, let it be. I mean, shadow banking in terms of diversifying the sources of funds for the economy in the sense of financing the economy, not through the banking sector, but through mutual funds or asset managers, that is a good thing. It's a positive phenomenon. It diversifies the risk away from the banking sector in a situation in which there is lack of credit. So I think we have to specify exactly what do you mean by shadow banking. Again, even this area needs to be regulated at some point in the future, because that could produce as well some risks. But that's it's not necessarily a bad phenomenon. Thanks.
To regulate activities and not entities, and then you can handle shadow banking and put it out of the shadow and in the light of the sun.
But central banks are working on that. I mean, in a way, they are perhaps going to be the users of this technology in the future, the main users in the future. Francesco?
Very shortly, first of all, I'm quite relieved to hear that most speakers agree that probably financial intermediation is not the area where the next crisis is going to come from, so that is reassuring for us in the sector. A short comment on the last topic that has been mentioned. We observe with interest the development at the margin of the financial sectors that are brought about by fintech, by distributed ledgers, by other financial innovation, part of which is also encouraged by legislation, for example, PSD2, which leads in Europe to open banking. We are not afraid of the competition that this leads, and we're open to consider also some potential synergies. However, naturally, we have some concern that the world should not go in the direction of having a super-regulated sector and a completely unregulated sector, so perhaps a spectrum of regulation, mostly for the protection of consumers, is something we should encourage to introduce. For example, we are not of the view that blockchain or other cryptocurrencies are inherently fraud. I think they can develop in positive ways, but it's interesting that while us bank have been pushed to invest many millions of euros to create very rigorous and solid KYC and anti-money laundering systems, then cryptocurrency suddenly leads the way for potentially completely unregulated transfer of wealth. So that is a concern that we have, but I think is something that should be addressed. Finally, an area of major concern for us, where we are therefore investing considerable amount of IT spending, is cybersecurity. We do fear that a single bank or the entire system can be brought down by a considerable accident, and therefore we're working intensely in this direction. You can never say you're fully protected, but we think over the last few months alone we've made considerable progress toward the protection of our systems and of our customers.
For us to close.
Okay. Now I just pick the point about the global value chain, because I completely agree with the argument that protectionism actually is breaking global value chain. This is very dangerous. So when we talk about potential trade war between the US and China, we always focus on the global value chain, because this is the area that you have to evaluate how harmful it's going to be. But nowadays, I think we won't have a concrete reasons to convince ourselves to, find out solution for both sides. But anyway, another point is stronger dollar. So how likely it is? I mean, what if the U.S., the Trump really implemented what he wanted to do, and then of course, the consequences is that the dollar will appreciate, and with the normalization, the monetary policy, the higher rate, and then the capital will flow back to the U.S., of course. So that actually is really something, dangerous. It's not dangerous, it's a risk for many emerging economies, because they are going to be facing a sort of a dilemma. Whether you want to manage your currency to stabilize your own currency, or you have a sort of, just suffering a little bit from those consequences. But of course, for the U.S., a stronger dollar actually is not helpful for the deficit cut. This is kind of, it's like it's two sides of one coin. I'm not sure, but from the Chinese policymakers, I think they would probably like the currency, to be more flexible, and to use the currency as a buffer. So this is probably the better way to do in face of such an uncertainty. And of course, capital flow is another issue. And I think, when we talk about the trade relation as economists, we always think it's not only about trade. For instance, the U.S. is running deficit with China, but somehow China becomes the creditor to the U.S. to finance this deficit. So this is kind of coin, two sides of one coin. And if you decide to do something on trade, and there are some consequences on the other side, it's not only trade, it's finance area. And so I don't want to raise this hot issue, but something I think we need to have a cooler head to think it over, the consequences. But actually, it's too dynamic. I just we just wait. Because so far it's just a tit for tat talking, and it's not actual. We have how many days? 60 days consultation. So we'll see what's going to happen. We just pick this point.
Dr. Parigi, suppose I ask you the following question. What do you think about the G20? The G20 agenda, the fact that, are we on the right, is it useful? Are we on the right, can we hope, I don't know what you can say, but...
No, of course it is useful. No, you see, I have just two remarks that can clarify the usefulness of G20 as a forum for discussion. The first remark is about economic policy. What we were talking about this afternoon was, this is my interpretation of course, is that the real game changer for the world economy is to find the right mix among monetary policy, fiscal policy, and structural reforms. Think about, for instance, the United States, following what Brad said before. Probably is not the right mix when you have an economy at full-blown like the US to implement a fiscal reform like the Trump's one that is going to put pressure probably on the monetary policy to become more restrictive in a sense, because probably this is going to put pressure on inflation, and then this is force the monetary policy to react increases in rates, with all the negative consequences in terms of exchange rates and probably whatever, as Brad said before. So this is the right place where to discuss these issues is a forum like the G20, where the real point is how to find altogether the right mix, because the fourth ingredient is international cooperation. The policy mix may work at national level if there is a sort of coordination around the world. If everyone is trying to find the right mix, taking into account also the policy decisions of other countries. So this is why the G20 is not only useful, but crucial. And the other point, the second remark, is about this discussion about fintech. I don't want to talk about only cryptocurrency or crypto asset, as you may call them. Fintech is more general, is very, very pervasive. And here we have also to consider that once we are convinced that something very new and unknown up to now, like crypto assets or Bitcoin or whatever you want, how they work, and if we want to regulate this, we have not to extend this regulatory impulse to all of the fintech aspects of feature, because we have also to take into account that many developing countries are benefiting a lot from fintech advances. Think about financial inclusion in developing countries, in China, for instance. This has allowed these countries to gain a lot of time in terms of closing the gaps with respect to the advanced economies. A very, very concrete example, think about the issue of remittances. You know, remittances are a source of income for poor countries, in the sense that the workers that emigrate then send back money. This is a problem that may have a lot of impulse, may be favored a lot by the improvement of fintech, because it can reduce costs. If you think about the cost of transmitting of sending money from one country to the other, they are very, very high, and they cannot be reduced like this. I mean, there is a policy, there was a policy of the World Bank that tried to reduce the cost at 5% in 10 years from 15%. They succeeded only in reaching 8%. So here there are, this is just an issue, but there is also the counterexample in the sense that if you don't take an eye on this situation, then with fintech you may have all sorts of other problems coming from financing of terrorism, cyber security, so on and so forth. So it's a very complicated issue, and as a complicated issue can be very, it's clear that can be analyzed and gain a lot from the work of an international forum like the G20. Thank you.
Brad, what about the impact of the regime change that we observe in the States with Trump on financial regulation? I mean, we're talking a lot about fiscal policy, about trade policy. Is Trump a possible trigger of confusion and disorder, and also on financial regulation?
International cooperation.
You know, I guess one of I'm fumbling. I was trying to be clever. I think, you know, when Trump came in, he was probably inclined to think that the rest of the world was imposing harsh regulatory standards on the United States, and all this international cooperation was just holding back U.S. loan growth. And then I hope, or maybe I imagine, that some of my former colleagues at the U.S. Treasury were able to explain that the U.S. capital standards are actually substantially tougher than the global standard, and that the main U.S. goal in International Financial Regulatory Forum has been to convince other countries to hold their banks to the same standard that the U.S. holds its banks to. And so therefore, the Financial Stability Forum and such were not a threat to U.S. sovereignty. Second point, and I think it's an important point, is that within the realm where Trump has been Trump, so far at least on the financial regulatory side, I will give Trump credit for being relatively responsible. The selections that the president has made for the Federal Reserve Board fall well within the mainstream. And while certainly there is a tendency towards deregulation, I don't think there is a desire to burn down the house. Third point, it's probably an important point as well, is that the financial regulatory reform, in order to pass the Senate, would require bipartisan cooperation and democratic votes. And as a result, the reforms being discussed that seem to be most likely to pass moderate some of the changes that were introduced with Dodd-Frank, but they don't really tear up the underlying framework. That maybe is too optimistic because much can be done through executive action. But right now, I would say the international financial regulatory system doesn't appear to be the first item in President Trump's targets, or the first among President Trump's targets.
Well, that's encouraging. I knew a little bit the answer. This is why I asked the questions. I wanted to end up with some more rosy horizon. Jose, the final word is with you before we leave. I'm sure that you will find something interesting to
Yes,
tell us.
I have a to be back. So what we have...
Read our briefs.
Yes, you might read our briefs, yeah. But what we say, it's almost gone for practical purposes. The world economy is growing again. 2010 was a very good year. Last year was the best since 2010, when the economy recovered. And growth was spread throughout the world last year. I'm not so sure it's so well synchronized as this moment. I think it has weakened a little bit in some parts. But it's hard to find a country where the forecast is for recession this year. Last time I tried to do that exercise, I found 6 or 7 countries in a sample of more of 100. So the economy is growing. I think if you let that growth occur and you don't stop it, that will solve many of the problems that lie behind the social discomfort that voters are expressing everywhere. 20 years ago, the emerging countries were against globalization. This time, emerging countries are in favor of globalization. When you suffer a crisis, and when that crisis brings your world down completely, and you think you have a future, and then that future disappears, it's very logical to react in very bad manners. In emerging countries, that was almost instantaneously. In the US or in Europe, it took more years to appear. But as growth was weak, finally politicians found other plays that were more lucrative. I think also taking some pages from the book of emerging markets, that what you have to do is try to work hard and to bring back your economy and your political system to more constructive ways. But that's a job for politicians. That needs some time. As Parigi said, you have to take care of those that were displaced by the crisis, by technological change, not by migrants, because there are not so many. But the jobs they think are now in emerging markets, they are not anywhere, because technological change have liquidated them. And as technological change is getting more rapid, and we have artificial intelligence and many things that are now replacing non-routine jobs, we might face in the future, not in the past, a very challenging time. So I think for the US, for Europe, for the advanced economies, you have a huge challenge ahead that other countries, more poor, have solved in the past, and now it's your turn to lead. When emerging markets were angry, they lacked the muscle to change the world. When the US is angry, it has the power to do whatever it wants. And I think in that sense, maybe financial crisis can be back if we make huge mistakes. But if not, I think we are in a better position to have this kind of growth and recovery and make more people join this recovery movement.
I'm very glad that you concluded with these observations. I think that these observations that the emerging markets are in favor of globalization, and the fact that you recall the benefits of globalization for these countries, it's crucial and could be the theme of another conference in a way, where we at so-called advanced economies, we must be careful not to be on the side of conservatism, on the side of refusal of the trouble of change, because this is what really globalization drives. It's the trouble of changing also the institutions and the rules of the game so as to adapt to the new world. So we are much more comfortable in our rich countries in a way, but we must be careful because being obstacles to change could be really a big responsibility towards the countries that are really changing fast, and they have changed also in our favor, because after all, if much of our employment is due to the fact that other countries are increasing fast, not only much of our unemployment, also much of our employment. You also observe that things are going well in the world economy, and there is this gap between the positive situation of the economy and the worrisome situation of politics and international relations. And this contrast is what we have to deal with in the near future. It's a very dangerous contrast. I see at least two dangers. One is the fact that in looking at the economic situation, we'll fall into what I would say is the cyclical illusion or a short-termism. We don't see that the situation is going to be worse in the day after tomorrow, so to speak. And the official forecast also in macroeconomics tell us that we should be careful there, because we are certainly in a good situation, but if you look at the official forecast for next year and the year after, I mean, they are not that beautiful as we could think. So the cyclical illusion and the short-termism is the first danger. And the second danger is that being complacent with the current economic situation, we don't take the opportunity, the window of opportunity of intervening on institutions, on politics, so that the political situation improves. We prefer to concentrate on the benefits of economic growth and of economic stability, relative stability, and prosperity, and we tend to underestimate the importance to concentrate on politics and reforming institutions and getting the new rules for several of our activities, and in particular caring about international relations. We have to resume the ambition to really have a world which talks together and cooperates to be better in the future. So we do our best at think tanks to promote the discussion and to make proposals for. We hope not to look like, you know, angels coming from the sky, but we hope to be realistic enough. And but still, we have to appeal to the goodwill of our leaders. Thank you to everybody, and thank you to you for being with us.